All right.
Good.
This way we can maybe post this one, and
Sure,
hopefully more will be able to attend in the future. So this lesson in part 1 is going to highlight some key protests against injustice in American history and the music that propelled and sustained them, as well as the Jewish involvement in these major issues. And most specifically, we'll start with the era of civil rights movement, okay, with other eras sort of explored as well. If we have time today, then we'll also dive into a bit of how the Passover Seder serves as an example and a model for the revisioning, refocusing, and utilization of rituals and moments in the service of social justice themes. Oftentimes in modern day interpretations of the Passover Seder, you'll hear some pretty intense acknowledgments of the injustices in today's world and how they relate to what happened during the time of the Pharaoh, right? And how we were slaves in Egypt, and so we need to acknowledge and be making those rituals more meaningful today, right? And how we can connect to modern day pharaohs. Oftentimes we hear readings about that. So that is part 1 of this lesson. Then in part 2, we'll start looking at moments of musical performance in the civil rights era and how music and musicians have responded to the civil rights movement. And then how Jews in all different genres have related to moments of injustice. So we'll see how far we get today. I'm kind of excited to begin. No, I'm really excited to see you, Ryan. You can sit, relax, hang out. I hope more friends come. It's certainly not meant to be all remote, but it just happened to be that most everyone is online. So that is why I'm happy that you're here. But I'm going to do my best to keep the video panel up as well as having people in person. So I'll start with a quick clip or just a moment of this. We'll see if you recognize the song. Hopefully you will.
May we be blessed to build this world from love.
I don't know.
must build this world from love. Ya-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And if we build this world from love, ya-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, then God will build this world from love. Ya-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Old love has said you are dead. Ya-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Old love has said you are dead. Ya-da-da-da-da-da-da.
So the song continues on and ends with this message, right? Olam chesed yibaneh means let a world of loving kindness be built, right? And it was written by, if you saw at the very beginning, you have Rabbi Menachem Creditor and then his wife Neshama Karlbach. It is written by Rabbi Creditor. And the way he balances that Hebrew is with a very active, I will, you will, we will, and God will build. So all together, we will build this world of love. But he indicates really, it starts with you and me, right? I do it, you do it. Before God gets involved at all, it is the work of our hands that create this world of loving kindness, right? So I want to start the class with this. How do we do that? How do we build this world of loving kindness? Any thoughts? Music is one way. It is certainly a universal language, as we have determined. Any other thoughts? Setting an example. Daryl says, by setting an example. Okay, absolutely. Janine?
Being a helper, volunteering or being a helper in some way.
Absolutely. When you see a need, you fill it.
Being open-minded to our experiences.
Staying open-minded, right? If you're experiencing something that someone else is not, being open-minded to their own experience. Absolutely, that's a way to build that world. So we begin this lesson with, Irene, did you want to say something? You want to add? Or Martine?
I said by actively being respectful of people and setting an example.
Absolutely. Setting an example of what it looks like to be actively respectful. Definitely. Especially when it comes to someone who you may have a disagreement with in terms of your ideals, right? There are ways to approach conversation. There are ways to approach even the work of justice work, when you and a colleague do not agree with the methodology. There's a way of approaching them from a level of empathy and loving kindness that builds a better world than had it just been my way or the highway, right? You want to build those bridges rather than break them and make it harder to be successful. Absolutely. Oh, we have such a brilliant class. So you have really set up this idea beautifully. In Judaism, especially, we really do have this impulse to build a better and kinder and more loving world, right? That is a major aspiration of the Jewish faith, right? We want to build from a place of joy and of love and of support. And so there is an impulse in Judaism to do justice work. Absolutely. I mean, we are B'nai Tzedek, right? We have this built intrinsically into who we are, right? So it is a very prominent category of mitzvot. It is understood as both an imperative in our religion, as well as a responsibility that we all carry, both individually and collectively. And it even says in the book of Deuteronomy exactly what's on the back of our board, right? Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice, you must pursue. You have to do this as part of being a Jew. Right? So where is this imperative? Where does it come from? Where is it built into our system? You see it mostly in our Nevi'im, our prophets, right? In the book of prophets, we have a major call to social justice. And in our tradition, in our Reformed tradition, there has been a huge calling back to the prophets, and specifically when it comes to how we approach why we're doing our justice work. Okay. The Nevi'im is what we read for our Haftorah, and generally it supplements what you're reading from the Torah. And oftentimes these prophets are calling out the social ills in our community. They're telling us what's wrong, right? They're reminding us that these things aren't working in our society, and it's our job to fix it. It's our job to fix it. So one of the major ones that we can look at comes from Isaiah. And I'll see if I can find it here for us to pop up on the screen. Isaiah 58, 6-7. There is an understanding within this that we use as a basis for much of our justice work. And I'm wondering if you can recognize the time in which we read this during the year.
Is this not the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring to your house the poor who are cast out? When you see the naked, that you cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh. Then your light shall break forth like the morning. Your healing shall spring forth speedily.
Anyone recognize when we read this during our yearly cycle?
Only ask me exactly which service I'm not that.
So Daryl says it's somewhere in the high holidays. Can anyone imagine when in the high holidays we might read this particular moment?
But it says fast, so it must be Yom Kippur.
Yes. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. So we read this portion. This is not the fast that I desire, right? And then he goes into what is the fast we desire, right? To share and do not ignore others. And he further goes, you have to kind of skip ahead in Isaiah up to Isaiah 9 and 12. And Isaiah then says, when you do this, when you fast with purpose, i.e., you share with others, you take the poor into your homes, you clothe the naked, you do not ignore the plight of others. When you do this, God will respond. And when you cry out, God will answer, I am here. But only if you banish injustice from your midst, only if you send away the menacing hand and twisted speech. Then people from your midst shall rebuild ancient ruins. You shall restore foundations laid generations ago. Then you shall be called repairer of fallen walls, restorer of lanes for habitation. So we read this on Yom Kippur. We do. And this is a day when we seek atonement, right? We seek to make tshuva and to think about our inner work and the things that we've done wrong that we need to atone for. It's a day when we make reconciliations between us and God, right? And also between ourselves and others, right? We abstain from food, we abstain from doing pleasurable things, and we concentrate on these very weighty concerns of the world. But this Haftorah doesn't just say you need to fast and think about yourself and your own sins and the things that you've done wrong. What is the task in this Haftorah? We read this on Yom Kippur afternoon, by the way. It's not the morning, when we're a little hungry, but we're okay. We're holding up. We're getting there. We're hearing all the beautiful choir, and we're kind of, in that okay, we're here, we're ready, we're thinking maybe more about ourselves. By midday, we're hurting, right? Brian's right, we're hurting. And Isaiah comes up and says, knock it off. It's not just about you. It's not just about your own ills. Yeah, you're suffering right this second, but think about everyone around you, right? So why would we read this? I gave you kind of a preview. Why would we read this halfway through Yom Kippur? Why would our rabbis so bravely put this in the middle of our day? Any thoughts?
Their time or our time?
Both. Daryl asks, in which context? The context of them or our current context? Well, we still read it, right?
I think it's an opportune time to, you got an audience and you want to promote your values. Okay.
Daryl says this is the opportune moment you've got a rapt audience with rapt attention to promote your values. This is the time. This is the time. Other thoughts?
Well, maybe to remind you to stick with it, and in case you're tempted to go to McDonald's.
I can see that.
What's the meaning of it?
It's a reminder to take it. It's that there's greater meaning in this, right? It's not just a day for you to suffer, but that you should stick with it. Okay, I could see that.
I see it as you have made a choice to not eat on the day of Yom Kippur, but others do not make that as a choice. They are hungry and they are poor and they do not have the clothes that we have.
Yeah, so this is the reminder. You're sticking with this for one day. Imagine those around you who don't have to stick with it. They just have to live with it. Absolutely. And so putting this in the middle when you're really starting to suffer and your stomach's growling, it's a reminder. It's a reminder. So then if we look at the bottom of this Haftorah, when Isaiah says, the people from your midst shall rebuild ancient ruins, you shall restore foundations laid generations ago. In terms of social justice, what are these ruins? What are these foundations? What are we being tasked to do here?
We're tasked to repair the world.
So repair the world. Brian saying bring back those who've fallen away. So Brian says this is an opportunity for us to, and connecting to what Martine said, heal the world by bringing those back into the fold who may have fallen away, whether it was their own fault or the fault of something else or their own situations. Sure. Absolutely. So if we turn our eye to Yom Kippur and say that instead of just our own personal day of atonement, if we frame it as a day, having an emphasis, especially in that afternoon period and moving into the new year, as a means of social justice, of recognizing the need for social justice, how can we interpret other elements of that day in terms of setting, in terms of that justice? Can we reframe any of the other thoughts that we may have been looking at from other lenses? I know that for me, the idea that there's this theme of reconciliation, right? You reconcile with those around you, and you reconcile, with both God, but also people, right? I can see that as a very important social justice theme as well, right? If a nation is at war with another nation, how can you seek to pursue justice in the new year, right? If you're, how can you look at your neighbor as yourself more than you might have been in a broad context, right? In a more personal way, maybe you can think about, okay, well, I wasn't giving to this organization because of X, Y, or Z person that I was upset with, but am I focused so heavily on the person rather than the entire meaning of their organization, right? Am I using a personal vendetta that then ends up hurting a greater group of people, right? There are certain choices that we make as human beings that may be very selfish in nature that may be affecting those around us. Yeah, Daryl.
What is justice in relation? If you look back in time, it's all a little bit different. It's just tough to remind sometimes watch Gunsmoke. And their idea of justice would be contrary to us when we got two guys go off the street, the marshal shoots them down, there's justice. We would consider that ridiculous by today's standards as a form of justice. So everything fits as to what the context and time is.
So the idea of justice, as Daryl says, it changes based upon the context, time frame, who we are as a people in a given moment. And the interesting thing about the ways in which our prophets write is that in every age and stage, you can interpret it differently. Absolutely. And that actually leads into our next thought. Okay. In the conservative movement, they actually have what's called Project Isaiah during the Yom Kippur timeframe. And every year they seek to find ways to use his words to do justice work over the high holidays. And each year it's a little bit different. They collect food, they do X, Y, or Z things in order to exemplify his words in different ways. So one way in a contemporary setting that Isaiah's words have been used were in music, right? Although Haftorah itself, the cantillation for Haftorah might be the oldest setting for Isaiah, after the death of Martin Luther King, there was a desire by many artists to try and use his words and use the language of Isaiah and the language of justice work to lift the work, to lift him. So Dave Brubeck, right, he wrote this cantata and he called it The Gates of Justice. And in The Gates of Justice, he excerpts Isaiah 58. He pulls those words and he uses the same 4 verses of the Haftorah that we just discussed. So we're going to listen to some of The Gates of Justice. Okay, it's a choral version, so there's some, moments that are very high and moments that are not. And it's fascinating to see the way he interplays the more high choral sounds with his jazz skills, right? And I want you to think about the message of this piece and how the music itself interacts with it. So we want to think about what's the message of this movement in the Gates of Justice? And based on the selection, how does Brubeck and therefore his music react to the death of this social justice icon? Very timely with his death just passing and MLK Day. All right, so I'm going to play Open the Gates. Hopefully, if it actually now you can access this, by the way, as well. At the Milken Archive of Jewish Music, Milken has provided thousands upon thousands of musical resources for free. He's uploaded them. He has a whole wonderful foundation. So there's Jewish history, there's music, there's artists, there's articles, oral history. It's a really wonderful resource. So that's just a piece of it. If you listen to, I'll pull it up on YouTube as well, so you can hear the beginning of it. Just from that excerpt, so far, what are your thoughts on the way that he's acknowledging it? Go ahead, Gerald. You are muted though.
I think there's some anger in it. It's very forceful, but it sounds like he's got some points to make.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's definitely a feeling of urgency, right?
Yes.
And anger and frustration, right? The ways in which Irene, did you want to say something, or Martine?
Nope. No, I was just thinking, I felt the urgency of the music.
Okay, so let me see what I can do here. This should be right. So he starts to really have that intensity and that movement because he's frustrated. He's very frustrated, right? He's finding he's finding ways to express himself. Why is it doing this?
You can
Um,
almost hear him saying, come on, people, move, do something.
He's speaking up as well. So not only anger, but
It's anger and intensity and also a desire for
When your hotel room
movement.
is your
Ah,
bedroom and your living room and your dining
oy
room.
vey. Yeah, it is absolutely a call to action, right? It is absolutely a call to action. And it's gonna drive me crazy. I will find it. There we go.
Open to me the gates of justice. I will enter there and give thanks to the I will give thanks to thee, for thou hast answered me, and having won my salvation, the stone that
You can see him building that intensity. Feel the intensity.
has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and is marvelous to behold.
So I skipped us ahead just to get to like the more intense part, right? So after that initial choral, yeah, what are impressions of this? Yeah, go ahead, Sherry.
Here in this piece, how many times repetition of a particular idea and repetition, how great this sounds, how loud this sounds for some. So
How loud, so Sherry's saying the volume, right? There's moments, it's okay. There are moments in which it is very loud, and there are moments in which it is quiet, but there's a repetition of those words over and over. Open the gates, open the gates, open the gates, over and over. Other thoughts? Yeah.
that's exactly the right
Sure.
in my mind.
My thought is I'd love to be in synagogue during this performance.
Yeah, the idea of this being performed in synagogue. This was written, I believe, almost right after his death. This was not a recent piece, although now, you know, when this was recorded, I don't remember. I think it was recorded in 2004 or something like that. But it was written very soon after he passed. And you know, you can almost feel the pain and the anger and the frustration in the way that he's expressing himself. And so you can imagine sitting in synagogue, absolutely, after experiencing this great loss for everyone in the civil rights community, right? This wasn't just a loss for one group of people. This was a loss for humankind, right? And so the way that Brubeck intersperses the words of Isaiah, the words of the people, with his own jazz tones and his own his trio, right? You have the cantor, you have the choral art society, you have a real interspersing, and yet there's a sense of urgency here. Now is the time, right? Now is the time to set it apart.
It's a collective of all the different resources and sources to put this on, which is symbolizing the collectiveness of people moving through kind of the changes.
So Brian expresses that this song is a collective effort, right? You don't have one voice. You don't have one musical trio. You have a choir. You have a cantor, a single voice, a collective. You have the jazz musicians. You have the choral musicians. You have very clearly a large group coming together to create this piece. Much, very symbolic of what Brubeck is trying to express, which is that this is a collective pain, a collective anguish, and a collective need to move forward with urgency to pursue justice, to pursue justice. Absolutely. Well, I was just summarizing. So connecting to that, the idea that, especially in Judaism, there is a call to action and a call to protest in art in all forms to make the world a better place is huge. At the Pittsburgh Convention in 1999, the reform movement stated we are obligated to pursue tzedek, to pursue justice and righteousness, and to narrow the gap between the affluent and the poor, to act against discrimination and oppression, to pursue peace, and to welcome the stranger. The artists and the composers, lyricists, musicians that we're going to encounter throughout the next series of lessons have pursued this particular call to righteousness and transformative behavior and the ideas of tzedek in the community from their Jewish perspective, from their Jewishness, even if it's not directly expressed. With Brubeck, you can tell he pulled in directly from our tradition. He's got the quotations from Isaiah that he has pulled, right? But obviously, just like we learned through Jewish jazz, some Jewish musicians express their Jewishness in a more veiled manner, right? But all of the Jewish music that we'll be listening to over the next, or all the musicians that we'll be listening to that identify as Jewish, right? Throughout the next through a few sessions, use this idea of their Jewish roots to pursue justice, even if it's in a secular manner, right? Okay. So what is interesting about this is it's a reminder that being a Jew doesn't intend for Jewish living to be a pastime, but actually something that you physically act upon every day. You are living it, you are embodying it, and it is something of consequence. And I even found this interesting quote. So Abraham Joshua Heschel, Rabbi Heschel, he explains it like this. Know that every deed counts, every word is power. And above all, remember that you must build your life as if it were a work of art. As if it were a work of art. Yes.
And you said every word is power. Yeah. Because it's just has a different meaning. Every instrument.
Hi, Jessica. How are you?
Like something. They express things a little bit differently. Some of them express them more specifically, and a group of violins together, string instruments, can express something that a whole orchestra may not be able to hold together. But like Dave Brubeck, the drums together, and like you said, the volume has a different way of saying it.
Yeah, so just like every word has power, Sherry connects this to that every particular choice by a musician in terms of which instruments are used,
Right.
which instruments are not used, which instruments are used together can express a different meaning as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Which instrument has a louder voice?
Right, and which one does the artist choose to have the louder voice? Is the vocal louder, or is the trumpet louder, or is the drum louder? That is a choice. Daryl, yes?
So, it's interesting about the music. You could do a lot of things with the music. You could stir up a crowd to riot. You could stir a crowd up to calm down by the tone of the music. And so music in itself is neutral, in my opinion. How we use it, that's it. Because I remember seeing an exhibit that I can't even find on the internet that in the Smithsonian about 30 years ago, the music of the Nazi composers. These are composers in Nazi Germany. And it was scary stuff to listen to. My friend who's not Jewish, who toured, he turned pale. It shook him up so much. It probably didn't shake me up, but the idea of a Nazi, but that music would scare the out of you. And other music will get you to protest. Other music will make you happy. You do music like at weddings, I'm sure, has to make people happy and joyous. And so music itself is neutral, is how we use it.
Absolutely. So Daryl says music itself is a neutral, it's a neutral art form until it is infused with meaning, right? The way in which an artist chooses to utilize their art form or utilize the sounds and put it to a group of people and present it, that is how the music gets imbued with power and how the music can be used. And so when we're looking at this, so you notice this slide is about music and protest, right? We just happen to see with this one. One way for people to have their voices heard and to speak truth to whatever power they feel or to redress specific grievances is to stage these public protests for whatever it is that they feel they wish to protest in the world, right? And so it can take a lot of forms. There can be rallies, there can be sit-ins, there might be boycotts or walkouts, picket lines, lots of marches, many different ways, right? I'm going to focus on nonviolent action at this point, right? There's There's a list somewhere out there, there's like 198 ways to non-violently protest. And and there's more, of course. But within all of these movements, you'll find music. You'll find music as a way to rally the people. There are speeches lifted by sound behind it. There's chanting, there's repeated back and forth call and responses. There's symbols, there's signs, and also choice of venue, right? Where are you choosing to enact this protest? Will it be a place where the music will be amplified? Will it be an intimate gathering in which the music needs to be more quiet and forceful? In a giant location like this in front of City Hall, you might need a pretty big amplifier in order to get your sound heard, right? In order for there to be a chant back and forth, you're going to need a big microphone, a big amplification of sound, right? So when you think of public protest, what comes to mind for you? And are there any types of music that you have experienced maybe in a protest that you've gone to, or or that you've seen that you felt was particularly effective while experiencing or hearing about said protests? Daryl?
I'm thinking about the types of protest singing folk music. And one thought that comes to mind, one of my favorite, Pete Seeger. He can influence a crowd, but anybody ever heard of a riot after he sung? No. His tone of everything was encouraged action, but did not stir up anger. Yeah, that's the right word, Sherry said, anger.
So Daryl brings up Pete Seeger, and in the folk protests or musical protests during the primarily during the 60s, anti-Vietnam protests, things like that, war movements, civil rights movements. When Pete would go and play, it was quiet, it was forceful, but it certainly didn't instigate rioting, right? It didn't whip into a frenzy. Absolutely. Other thoughts?
I was thinking the same lines. It's the Vietnam War protests with all the rock bands and the Bob Dylans and just everyone that was putting out songs protesting the war.
So in these particular war protests, the music itself, the words might have sounded angry, right? How many roads must a man walk down before you can call him a man? If you're just reading the lyrics, you're going to have an entirely different experience than when you hear the music itself, right? When you hear the ways in which those lyrics are expressed, you're going to get a different emotion, a different feeling. But also the way in which the song is interpreted could have a big impact, right? When you hear Bob Dylan singing it versus a man who just came back from the war, right? You may have a completely different experience as someone standing at a protest. Yes, Sherry.
Versus Joan Baez.
Okay.
He is very involved in anti-war, very involved, much more so. And I heard this, I'm not just making it up. I heard this much more so than Bob Dylan. He was more for anti-entertainment than Joan Baez. She was much more into the protest, into the anti-war. Bob Dylan wasn't the same way she was. I heard that, so I know that there was a comparison between the two of them. They didn't sing together and they did entertain together, but he was not the same feeling as she had.
So oftentimes it is true that the ways in which a musician interprets their music or chooses to use music as a platform will influence everybody around them differently. And when you're looking at a female musician during a protest movement, you're often going to get a different flair or a different feeling than a man who is in protest as well. Because there are different layers to a female during the 60s who's experiencing that pain versus a man who is experiencing other pains, right? There's different twinges. So Sherry was mentioning that Joan Baez and and Bob Dylan, although they both were a part of this movement during the 60s and had many problems with the social norms of the time, their interpretations and their music sounds different, looks different, and is experienced differently. And so actually that's an interesting transition, Sherry, and I love you for it, because I want us to look at women and the music that women brought to the suffrage movement and to civil rights a little bit, because we often talk, the first ones that came to our mind were Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan and sort of that male sound in protest. But we can forget at times women have always been at a forefront of suffrage, of many things, many social ills. And so I wanted to highlight 2 marches, and we might not get to both now, but we're going to start there, looking at the women's suffrage movement in 1913, and then the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, both of which had a lot of female involvement. The second one, more male involvement than the first. And just kind of looking at the ways in which music and Jewish women got involved in this suffrage movement. Okay, so this was, how many of you are familiar with the women's suffrage movement? Okay, so we won't go too deeply into it. Around 1909, there was a lot of, things going on, especially in California. The state of Washington approves women's suffrage in 1909, and then California in 1910. So we were at the forefront there, go us. And then we start to see Jews, non-Jews, religious Jews, secular Jews, as well as others in the community, but they very vocally supported women's suffrage, and Jewish women were key mobilizers. There was a politically and religiously conservative movement called Die Freie Welt, and they ran a column called From the Women's World, and it covered specifically suffrage activism around the world. So Jewish women were very aware of this movement and across the religious spectrum. So we weren't just looking at the Reformed Jews. Yes, Daryl.
In that period of time, and I'm not talking about today's political world, but the first states that the women the right to vote were red state, California was a red state then.
Yes.
Wyoming, Kansas, I believe, long before the other states were the ones that were probably more politically conservative, but respected rights. I'm not talking about today's skewed up world, but
Yeah, and Daryl brings up that absolutely during this time frame, California was a red state. The first, and so was Washington. So this was not considered a particularly liberal concern. It wasn't. It was just a right, and the conservative movement was fine with it. This was something that they were okay with as part of their platform of the time. Absolutely. Important point to make, absolutely. It wasn't a polarizing thing. It was just
these platforms on a lot of other issues, 50s, 60s, on other issues. They just took what was right. And that was the issue, not, hey, those guys are against it, I'm in favor.
So back then, what Daryl was saying is that when it came to suffrage, and we can, hello, Daryl. When it came to suffrage, it wasn't about whether you were a conservative, whether you were a Republican, Democrat, et cetera. It was more about the issue itself, right? And where you stood on each issue. And so, yeah, we're not going, it was not as polarizing as when you hit the 60s and you started to look at, real intense divisions along political lines. Now we can even point to the fact that we had all of those very conservative movements, conservative states, in favor of suffrage, as well as the workmen's circle of the time, who was also very active in this suffrage movement. And we're looking at the very far left, right? When it comes to workmen's circle, they were socialists. They were socialist leaning at the time. And they also felt that that was an important connection. The labor activists hammer the point home, and they wrote from the New York Women's Trade Union League, and we had, you know, the shirt makers strike, and we had many, many different organizations across the political spectrum coming together in protest of, in support of women's rights when it came to the vote. In 1913, we are coming off of, it was only 2 years prior to that, was the shirtwaist factory fire, in which we lost so many young girls, 146 garment workers, and 123 of them were women and girls, and they were mostly Jewish and Italian immigrants. And so this march had a lot to do with workers' rights and economic justice. And the suffrage movement moved in that direction. So part of this suffrage procession of 1913 was not just about votes for women, although they made that a prominent part of their platform, but it was also rights for women workers and rights for those who needed a voice in their government. Rights for those who needed a voice. Is the right to vote interconnected with economic well-being? Yeah. To what degree? Qualified, Daryl says.
Economic well-being, if it's across the demographic spectrum, yes. If you're looking at just numbers of an economy, no. Because you can have just rich people, say, and all the poor people, you have 90% of the population in poverty. I mean, that, so the right to vote deals with the equity of the wealth.
Absolutely, because our founding fathers based our country on white male landowners making up the laws. And so the equality comes in with the economics as women start making decisions on how, for taxes or whatever rights that they have as well.
So in the 1900s, it becomes a question of women are now outside of the home, they're working, and they deserve a right to speak upon how their money is used, how their taxes are used, how their government runs and functions in a way that maybe when the founding fathers started this whole thing, it wasn't a part of the conversation. We're going to stop there. Surprisingly, we've been talking for an hour, remarkable. When we come back, we're going to start looking at this procession, the musical choices of the procession, the chants that were said, the choices that were made in musical protest, and specifically the sort of Yiddish musicians that wrote songs in support of the women's suffrage movement. So we'll start listening to that. This is kind of our introductory lesson, just to make sure we all have the language of Tzedek in our minds and in our understanding. And we'll really deep dive into the music of those protests starting in 2 weeks. So I thank you all, and we will look forward to continued classes in the future. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Gerald. Thank you. Take care. Have a good night.